part of what you're eating is Wimpy's. All of us O'Neill kids grew up with Wimpy's because Mom worked at nights. Dad cooked dinner after he'd come home from the stockyards, and that was nothing but hamburger with beans in it. And my kids love it for some reason, but that's the way it goes. I want to thank you for thinking about our brother as he passed away, and son. 20 years ago, Mom's sister passed away, Marion, so it provides us another lynching time. Gus Nelson isn't here today, but Gus says of Bob that he's a man of his own. That's kind of the way he is. Today is not about sorrow, but about life. I'd like to tell you a story about a farmer. And that's what I am. I'm a storyteller, and I like to tell stories. It was around Christmas time, and the Christmas Mass was going to be said at the church, and this man's wife was at the kitchen counter getting ready and getting her coat ready. And she said to her husband, "Why won't you come with me to Christmas Mass? It's midnight Mass, why don't you come with me?" He said, "Honey, there's going to be a big storm coming up, and you know, I have a hard time believing in this thing. I believe in God, but this thing with Jesus, that God would want to become part of us, I can't understand. It makes no sense to me." She says, "I know, but I thought I'd ask you again." So she got in her car and she left for church. The man stood there, and a few minutes later the wind came up, the snow came up, and he looked out in the barnyard, and there at the light at the front of the barn doors was a bunch of geese. And these geese were standing in the light like it was some morning, and he knew it was really cold, and he thought, well, I'll go help them out a little bit. So he went around the back of the barn and went in, and he opened the front doors, and he turned the light on in the barn and thought that they would come in, but they didn't. So then he tried something else. He went and grabbed some grain and threw some grain out there, and they started picking at him. He thought they'd follow him into the door, but they never did. So he went around the barn, and it was freezing, and he was really cold, and he didn't wear an outfit. He tried to chase the birds in, but then they'd flap, and they'd get all over and come back to the same spot under the light in front of the barn. He said, "What is the matter with you guys? I'm trying to give you a place where you can be warm. What can be the problem with you?" And he tries to chase them again a few more times, and it doesn't work. And he looks at him, and he says, "Why don't you understand what I'm trying to do? If you could just understand what I'm saying to you, if I could just speak your language, if I could just be one of you for a few minutes, one of you." And the bells of the church rang, and he understood the inception of Jesus Christ and the power that gave God for us. Bob was kind of the same way. As I understand, Bob was always a man of God, but not necessarily one of Jesus. But he was baptized in the last few days, and we thank him for that. Stories about Bob. I'm going to tell a story about Bob, and then if you've got one, I'd ask you to tell a story about Bob, because we had a lot of good times together. When we were younger, we rode horses all the time. Donnie Van Every came over and stayed with us, and a mile up from our dead-end road was an old Mormon cemetery buried in a timber of Swanson's property that we bought part of that property a number of years later, and folks stayed on it. But we decided to spend the night in that cemetery, and we told ghost stories, and the three of us laid down and went to bed, and Bob wakes me up in the middle of the night. He says, "I'm going to run over to Swanson's and get a bucket of water. I'm going to get Donnie." So he went over and he got this bucket of water and a rope, and he climbed up that tree with that rope, and he tossed it down to me, and I tied it to that bucket of water, and he hauled it up the tree right above Donnie where he was sleeping. And we're sitting there, and all of a sudden, I'm laying there, and Bob goes, "Ooh," and Donnie wakes up and he says, I hear something. I said, oh, it's just an owl, go to sleep. He laid back down and Bob starts going, ooh. I said, oh my God, that sounds like a ghost. And Donnie looked up and Bob dumped that 5-gallon bucket of water. Bob dumped it. Donnie got up and ran. Didn't grab his horse, ran the 1 mile clear to the O'Neill house. Bob we had to saddle up our horses and get all the gear back together and the blankets, and we went back home. We got a little trouble that day. What we did to Donnie met him. But it was a good story. And some of you have good stories. Kevin?
Oh, I have a short story. Shortly after Pam and I were married, we lived in the trailer house in Persia, my mom and dad's farm. And Bob and I had been out hunting, and went into the house to see Pam for some lunch. And went to the back of the trailer house. I wanted to show him my new guns. Standing in front of my gun case, I was showing him all the goodies there, and I had a handgun. Well, I had blanks in the gun. And Bob was paying attention there. He was pretty close, and I shot him in the belly. He tells everybody that I shot him before, but he had a few fine words for me after that ordeal. If you can imagine Bob's big belly, he went, he thought he was shot. I remember that quite well.
He did the same damn thing to me too. I was driving the car and I let go of the steering wheel. We went down the ditch. Thank you, Kevin. Somebody else got something to say about Bob? Go ahead, Tim.
Speaking of horses, we rode horses all the time. The boys knew how to saddle that horse better than anybody. Well, this time, Mom was doing dishes and the horse was tied up to the tree. And she said, those girls want to ride that horse, Bob. Can you go out there and saddle that horse up for them? He wasn't very happy to do that for us. So he's done doing it. We go out there, we step in the stirrup, and off comes the saddle. He left it loose for us. So that was Bob.
Yep, there was. Anybody else?
Well, I think I have a story, and I think Don was riding horses with me, and we were with Bob, and we were riding on the dead-end road, and he was alone with an old barrel horse, and he wanted that horse, instead of taking the bridge, he wanted to show us he could get that horse to cross the creek. And that horse took a spanking, and another spanking, and old Bill, the horse, would get to the front of the creek, and it would he was just going to jump, and then he would back off. And they were both getting very tired of fighting the battle. So finally, Bill takes him to the creek, and he gets ready to lunge, but when he lunges, he spins and puts Bob in the creek. And he looked up at us and he said, I wish it had been a little bit darker so you didn't get to see that.
Bob and I a lot would go out riding horses at night. We lived on a mile dead-end road. And on Saturday nights, people thought it was good to go on that dead-end road and park and do what young people do on a dead-end road and park. And with two horses, Bob rode Pal. And Pal had the ability to go up on his hind legs and rear up. And he could just scare the hell out of the people in the backseat of the car. Anybody else got any comments? Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to tell you a story. Because I think it's an important story, and I tell a lot of classes that I've taught in church this. It's about a thespian. Anybody here know what a thespian is? Anybody got a hand that can tell me what a thespian is? Barb?
An actor.
An actor, right. And he was from England, and he came to the United States, and he would go from schools and churches, and he would put on his Shakespearean routine. And not unlike this little church here in Neola he went to, and he was putting on his routine one night, and people were enjoying him. He would do a little bit of Hamlet. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well, Horatio, for he rideth on his back whence I was a child, for he was the court jester, and my dad was his boss. And he'd do a little bit of Macbeth, off spot, off damn spot, or Double, double, toil and trouble, water burns and cauldron bubbles, we three witches shall meet again. And the crowd loved him. They were very entertained by the way this guy took Shakespeare and entertained them. So at the end of he said, does anybody have any requests? And so he did 3 requests and everybody was applauding. And he said, has anybody got any last requests? He said, Father, the priest, he said, Father, do you have any requests? And he said, yes, I do. I have one request. He said, would you do me a favor and read the 23rd Psalm for me? Because the 23rd Psalm is something we always say at funerals, but it's really a psalm for the living, not for the dead. And he said, Father, I would be more than happy to do that for you, but only under 2 conditions. One is that you bring me a Bible because I'm not versed in that, I don't remember it, and I'd like you to give it to me. And he said, Father brought him up the Bible, and he turned it to the 23rd Psalm. And he said, what's the other request? And he said, Father, when I get done reading it, I'd like a humble priest to read it for me. Father was really touched by this because this guy, in his voice and the way he did things, was really impeccable. But he said, okay. So the man grabbed it and he started off. He said, the Lord is my shepherd. And with this deep voice, he went through the 23rd Psalm like nobody had ever heard it before. And when he was done, there was nothing but uproarious claps and pride in the way he administered the 23rd Psalm to everybody that stood there. And it took forever to get everybody to quit clapping. And the humble priest thought, oh, this is not good. And the man walked over to the priest and he said, Father, it's your turn. And so the priest took it and closed the book. And he said, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He leads me down the path of righteousness for my name, for his name's sake. He renews my spirit. His rod and his shaft, they protect me. He sets a table for me in the presence of my enemies. He anoints my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of my Lord forever. I think Bob finally got there. I truly believe that.
Amen.
And now I'd like to do one more thing here. We got a few singers here.
There we go.
Did you pass around some of those?
Yep.
Now, what I'd like you to do is I play a harmonica. I'm going to play it in one key first, and then I'll come back and I'll play it multiple key. And I'd like you to start singing when I start playing in multiple key, okay?